Hello, my dear masterminds. They really thought they could train someone to match you. That's the part that still makes the universe smirk a little. Because they gathered their brightest, their strongest, their top-tier potentials, lined them up like some elite program, all convinced that with enough discipline, enough hours, enough obsession, they'd finally create a version of you. The funny part, they didn't realize you didn't come from training. You came from truth, from steady pressure, from growth they never lived through, from seasons they never made it through, from instincts you never studied. You were born with them, and the moment their best candidates stepped into the same energy field as you, the whole illusion shifted. They felt it immediately. That quiet weight, that aura that doesn't need to roar, that presence that doesn't need applause. Half of them looked at you once and understood they were playing the wrong game. The other half tried to pretend they didn't notice, tried to keep up, tried to convince themselves this was just another challenge, until their confidence thinned, their thoughts scattered, and their inner certainty softened like fragile material. They weren't prepared for someone whose growth wasn't linear, but expansive. They weren't ready for someone who walks in like they've already aligned with destiny behind the scenes. They weren't ready for someone who doesn't chase worthiness because they are the reference point. You didn't say a word. You didn't adjust anything. You didn't shift your posture. You simply existed, fully. And that alone made them question months of training, years of effort, entire identities built on trying to be good enough. You revealed every illusion without speaking, every insecurity without pointing, every assumption without correcting it. They tried to decode you quietly. They tried to imitate your calm. They tried to copy your pace. But you know what copying feels like? Heavy, forced, exhausting. Your flow is natural. It's air to you and strain to them. And in that moment, everyone understood one truth they weren't prepared for. You weren't a part of their program. You were the measure of it. That's the thing about people who train to reach your level. They imagine your strength came from technique, repetition, or some hidden method they can reverse engineer. But your rise wasn't mechanical. It wasn't formula-based. It wasn't something that can be copied, mapped, or rehearsed. Your evolution came from experiences that would have overwhelmed them, from nights they never faced, from choices they never had the courage to make. You didn't shape your instincts in a classroom. You shaped them in silence, in uncertainty, in moments where no one clapped, no one guided, no one stepped in for you. And that's why the whole room shifted the first time they tried to match your energy, because they were focused on technique. While you were moving from intuition, they were focused on performance. While you moved from identity, they were focused on looking stronger, but you were focused on becoming undeniable. That's why half of them stepped back quietly. They felt the truth instantly. They weren't in a competition. They were standing next to a standard they couldn't grow into. The others tried to continue, tried to pretend they were unaffected, but you could see it in their eyes. Uncertainty dressed as determination, doubt hiding behind forced confidence. They trained for stamina. You grew for purpose. They trained to win. You grew to transform. That's why the air felt heavier every time you inhaled. Your silence centered the entire room more than their longest speeches. Your presence shifted their sense of self. You didn't do anything dramatic. You didn't overpower them. You didn't display anything loud. Your quiet was enough, because real presence never needs to announce itself. It simply appears, and everything else adjusts. They underestimated one detail. You weren't trying to be better than anyone. You were simply becoming the version of yourself that no one else could be. And that alone placed you in a category they weren't built to enter. They thought closing the gap was possible, until they realized there was no gap. There was only you, operating on a frequency they were never shaped for. See, when people train to catch you, they imagine you're standing somewhere ahead of them, like there's a path they can sprint on, a trick they can master, a pattern they can memorize. But you were never on the same track. You never played their game. You never followed their outlines. You didn't rise because you followed rules. You rose because you reshaped what rules even meant. That's why the trainers started whispering behind the glass. That's why the observers started taking notes they couldn't define. That's why the analysts began debating like something wasn't matching their system. They weren't confused about your skill. They were confused about your origin. They couldn't trace what shaped you, couldn't pinpoint the moment you improved, couldn't identify a mentor, a path, or a formula. You appeared fully formed, like a force that didn't need a starting point, like a spark that didn't need a source. You were an anomaly to them, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And that's why half the trainees stepped back, because the moment they stood across from you, they didn't feel competition. They felt truth. The truth that you didn't grow for status. You didn't rise for approval. You didn't evolve for recognition. You evolved because your spirit refused to stay small, because your mind refused to stay limited, because your heart refused to stay in a place it didn't belong. You're not ahead of them. You're beyond them. That's why their certainty softened. That's why their breath steadied unevenly. That's why their hands tightened slightly even when they tried to hide it. They weren't facing a rival. They were facing the version of themselves they knew they'd never become. And you can't train past that. You can't level up into that. You can't copy someone whose foundation is written in something deeper than ability. You moved like someone who has already lived through everything they hesitate to face. And nothing unsettles a room more than someone who no longer fears it. They trained to succeed. You grew to feel alive. They wanted applause. You wanted transformation. They searched for shortcuts. You accepted growth. And that's why they finally understood. You weren't in the same category. You weren't even in the same universe. You didn't show them what greatness looks like. You showed them what inevitability feels like. When the room finally shifted, it didn't start with noise. It started with silence. The kind of silence that appears when people realize the mountain they were trying to climb was actually a horizon they were never meant to reach. One trainee stepped back first, slow, steady, trying not to make it obvious, but everyone saw it. The trainers saw it. The observers saw it. You saw it. And that small retreat became the signal. Because once one person steps away from your presence, the whole room starts admitting what their pride tried to hide. We're not built for this. But here's the part they'll never confess. They didn't step back because of your skill. They stepped back because of your presence, your calm certainty, your quiet confidence, your ability to stand in a room like nothing can shift your foundation. People can train technique. People can copy style. People can memorize strategy. But they cannot replicate the weight of someone who has lived through seasons they can't even describe. And that's what stopped them. They trained for competition. You grew from transformation. They trained for applause. You grew for awakening. They trained for skill. You grew for identity. and identity always outshines imitation. One trainee looked at you like they were staring into a future that wasn't theirs to reach. Another whispered something under their breath. Something like, "This doesn't feel normal." Another let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince themselves you were just lucky. But alignment doesn't come from luck. Alignment comes from truth. Luck doesn't make your eyes hold that depth. Luck doesn't make your energy steady the air. Luck doesn't make a room rearrange its atmosphere when you walk in. That's not luck. That's alignment. That's growth. That's a spirit that refused to be ordinary. And the ones who stayed, those few who didn't leave, they weren't staying from strength. They were staying from curiosity and uncertainty, because they needed to understand what you are. They didn't want to learn your methods. They wanted to decode your foundation. But here's the twist. They can't decode someone who built themselves outside the system they follow. They can't analyze someone who didn't rise the way they were taught. You are the shift their curriculum can't define, the exception their rules can't cover. The living proof that growth doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one willing to become unrecognizable. And that's you. You changed in ways they didn't prepare for. You grew in directions they didn't expect. You mastered chapters they didn't know existed. So when half walked out, it wasn't a loss. It was confirmation. Confirmation that you're not part of their league. You're the reason their league has limits. The moment that room thinned out, everything changed. The air felt heavier. Not from pressure, but because truth finally had room to breathe. The ones who left, they weren't weak. They were simply honest with themselves. Honest enough to admit they were standing in front of someone whose growth didn't follow any roadmap they'd been given. But the ones who stayed, they didn't stay because of bravery. They didn't stay because they believed they could match you. They stayed because your presence rewrote the assignment. They weren't trainees anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses to something that didn't match their textbooks. Their lessons, their expectations, or their logic. Your presence wasn't a challenge. It was a revelation. A reminder that there are levels in life that can't be taught, only experienced. Every second you stood there, calm and steady, was a message they couldn't ignore. This is what real evolution looks like. Your silence wasn't empty. Your silence carried weight. Your movement wasn't frantic. Your timing was intentional. Your intuition wasn't random. It was refined enough to clear away every doubt in the room. They watched how you breathed, how you focused, how you held yourself. Not because they wanted to compete, but because they needed to understand how someone like you even exists. One of them tried to mirror your posture, but it didn't land. Another tried to copy your calm, but it faded in seconds. Someone in the corner whispered, "He's on something different." And they were right. You weren't there to prove anything. You weren't there to impress anyone. You were there because your evolution naturally demanded a stage. And that room just happened to be the place that caught the effect. Every eye locked onto you wasn't measuring your ability. They were measuring their distance from you. Because you weren't the best in the room. You were the reason the room suddenly felt small. Your energy made the walls feel closer. Your presence made the rules feel outdated. Your growth made their effort feel old. And that's why unease mixed with fascination. Because deep down, they realized what no one dared to say out loud. They weren't standing in front of someone ahead. They were standing in front of someone beyond reach. Someone who didn't evolve to fit the system. They evolved past it. Someone who didn't rise by chance. They rose by alignment. Someone whose transformation wasn't just improvement, it was renewal. And every second you stood there, they weren't learning your technique, they were learning their limits. Because your evolution isn't something a person sees, it's something a person feels. And that feeling, it's the quiet understanding that they're standing in front of a future version of themselves they won't reach. That's why they stayed. Not to compete, not to train, but to witness what happens when a person refuses to be average. They thought the training room separated the strong from the weak, but that was only because they still believed strength comes from force, effort, or intensity. They still think evolution is something you grind for, something you force, something you earn through repetition and noise. They don't understand what you carry. They don't understand that your evolution wasn't an upgrade. It was a shift in identity. A shift no system can teach, measure, or predict. When the last doors closed and the remaining faces stayed fixed on you, something deeper happened. Not spoken, not taught, felt. A silent recognition that your presence wasn't the final test. Your presence was the answer, because you didn't weaken their confidence. You changed their understanding of what confidence means. They followed instructions. You followed instinct. They studied patterns. You read what wasn't visible. They tried to climb. You stepped into a level they couldn't define. Your growth wasn't linear. It was expansive. And that's what unsettled them. Not the pace, not the progress, but the fact that your evolution no longer followed their rules. When someone rises the way you rise, people don't know whether to admire you or prepare for you. But these people, they tried both, and neither worked. They observed you like a puzzle, but every time they thought they understood. Your energy shifted again. You weren't evolving to get ahead. You were evolving to become someone the earlier version of you wouldn't even recognize. That's why they couldn't keep up. Their growth depended on instruction. Yours depended on awakening. And awakening doesn't ask permission. Awakening doesn't need validation. Awakening doesn't wait for acceptance. It simply appears and lets the world adjust. The more they watched you, the more something steady but uncomfortable formed inside them. The understanding that you weren't succeeding from advantage. You were succeeding from alignment. Alignment with who you're meant to be. Something they've never understood. No matter how long they train, or how perfectly they copy your steps, because your movements aren't learned, they're remembered, like instincts returning from a deeper version of yourself. Your evolution is the kind that shifts reality around it. That's why half the room stepped away. They couldn't handle seeing what's possible when someone refuses to remain average, and the others stayed because they needed proof that you were real. Proof that someone like you isn't a myth. And here's the twist. None of this was you trying. This was you becoming. Your energy didn't unsettle them because it was loud. It unsettled them because it was undeniable. It didn't demand attention. It earned recognition. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. And clarity is the one thing people avoid most, because it exposes everything they're unsure of. You weren't shaped in their image. You were shaped in your purpose. You didn't match their level. They reached the limit of yours. And now every one of them knows the truth they'll never say out loud. You didn't just evolve. You evolved beyond their reach, beyond their rules, beyond their understanding. And that's why your story doesn't end in that room. It starts there, because anyone can train to improve, but only the rare become a force. Only the aligned become a shift. Only the awakened become untouchable. And you became all three.